Welcome to the Midnight Storytellers Legacy Project. I'm Chloe, and if you make yourself comfortable, I have a story to tell you. It was spring in the Highlands of Scotland, and a gentleman started to pay court to a lady. Both the families thought this was a good idea, and as the bracken unfurled green on the hillsides, the courtship went along. By the autumn, as the bracken turned brown and frail on the hillsides, the lady and the gentleman were married. It was a splendid wedding, and he took her to live with him in his tall house away in the mountains in the Highlands. And she thought she was going to be the happiest woman in all of Scotland. She had a fine, handsome, wealthy husband. She had servants. She had beautiful dresses to wear and jewelry. And everything was happy until the new year, until just after Hogmanay, when her husband came to her and said, "And now, my dear, it is time for you to start spinning. For a house is not a home and a woman is not a wife unless and until she can spin fine thread to make shirts for her husband to wear." And the wife looked at him and she said, "My husband, my love, I would gladly do as you ask, but I don't know how to spin. In my father's house, that was work for servants, not for a lady." For the first time since the wedding, her husband's face darkened with anger, and he looked at her and said, "Well, you had better learn, or else it'll be the worse for you." And the husband told the servants to take a spinning wheel up to an attic room at the top of the house and a pile of flax stems, and he told his wife to learn to spin. Well, she had no idea. She had absolutely no idea of any of the process. And it is quite a process. You have to ret the stems. That's soak them in water until they start to rot a bit. And then you have to separate the fibers of the plant stems. And eventually you come up with a fiber that you can spin on a drop spindle or a spinning wheel. Yes, I had to learn all of that. She couldn't. She wouldn't or couldn't ask the servants, and they wouldn't or couldn't tell her anything at all. After about 10 days, she brought a length of roughly spun, you could hardly call it thread. It was hardly holding together. It was full of knots and lumps. And her husband looked at it and he said, "Well, you'll have to do better than that, or else, my dear, it'll be the worse for you." And the next day he came to her and said, "I am going away on business for a week. And in that 1 week while I am away, you, my dear, you will spin me 100 hanks of the finest thread, or else I may have to put you aside." And the wife was truly frightened, because in those old days, if a husband was not satisfied with his wife, he was allowed to put her aside, which meant he could get rid of her any way he pleased, and no questions asked. And then the husband got on his horse and rode away, waving behind him. And the wife watched him go. She was so very frightened. She couldn't think, she couldn't do anything. She knew she could not learn to spin. She put her old cloak around her, and even though the weather was closing in across the Highland hills, she ran out of her fine house and out across the countryside. And maybe there was some thought in her head that if she ran hard enough, if she ran far enough, maybe she could lose herself out there in the Highlands. Maybe she'd drop down dead and that would put an end to all her troubles. But as a fine lady, well, she couldn't run very far at all. She got to the top of the first hill and she was completely out of breath, so she had to stop and shelter underneath a rowan tree, which even in that cold, dark time of year, there were shining scarlet berries dotted all over it. And as the lady stood there, catching her breath, even as the wind and the rain gusted around her, from somewhere beneath, from somewhere inside the hill, there came the sound of unearthly music, a harp trickling, a melody that wound itself around her, a melody that calmed her, as a harp will do. And the lady knew that this was no mortal tune she was hearing. She knew very well she was hearing the music of the fairy folk. And the lady remembered all the stories she had heard. She remembered that the fairy folk are tricky to deal with. They are not safe. They are dangerous. And she remembered that if you pick a twig of rowan and keep it in your pocket, then you have some magical protection against anything they might do to you. She picked her rowan, put it in her pocket, and then looked down for a way inside the hill, because her curiosity was unstoppable. And she saw she was standing on a big slab of stone. And without really thinking about it, she got down and she started to scrabble around with her fine white fingers. And she gouged and she dug and she scrabbled around the edge of the stone until she'd loosened it. And actually she could shift it and lift it and slide it aside. And there was an opening into the hill. It looked like a slide down into the hill. And without really thinking, she gathered her skirts around her and whoosh! Down she went, like a child slide, and swoosh! Out of the end, bump, and stood up and looked around. She was in a cave, but the most beautifully appointed cave, with little chairs and cushions, and a fireplace with a good blaze at the far end of the cave, and sitting all around were tiny little women. 7 very small women in gowns of bright green silk, and each one of them busy at something. One of them was sketching and drawing, and one of them had embroidery. And one of them, of course, was playing the harp. And one of them, sitting near the fireplace, had a spinning wheel, and her foot was working the pedal, and the wheel was turning, and she was drawing out the finest white thread. And of course, as soon as the lady saw that, all her troubles came heaping back upon her, and she burst into tears. And the lady in green at the spinning wheel looked up at her and said, "And what are ye gleatin' about? You got a handsome husband, you got a fine house, you got servants, you got nothing to fuss about." And so the whole story came out. And the 7 little women in green listened and looked at each other. And as the story of the wife came to an end, the 7 little ladies in green just started to laugh. Oh, how they laughed, clutching their sides. And that was when the wife realized what she'd been seeing that was so odd, so strange about them, because each one of these little women in green silk, each one had a twisted mouth, a lopsided mouth, a mouth so twisted and lopsided it was like a Scots pine tree leaning on the wind in a gale. And when they'd all finished laughing, the senior of the little women in green silk, the one who'd been spinning, she looked at the wife and she said, "Well, if that is all your trouble, I'm sure that we can help you. Don't worry about spinning. Don't even think about it. Just go home and make all ready for when your husband shall return. And the night that he does, ask us to dine. Invite us to dine in your house, and we'll sort your husband out for you." And the wife, not without a certain churning of her insides, a certain misgiving, for these were the fairy folk, and their powers were strange and limitless. But what did she have to lose? She smiled, she curtsied, she said, "If you can help me in my troubles, I will be grateful to you for the rest of my life." And that, of course, is the correct way to speak with the fairy folk. And so the wife suddenly found herself back out on the hillside and hurrying home through the sleet. And when she got home, she never went up to the attic for the rest of that week. She didn't even think about spinning. She had complete confidence in the little ladies in their green silk gowns. And so it was that the husband came trotting home on his horse, and his wife ran out into the courtyard to greet him, helped him down from the horse, flung her arms around him in welcome, and told him, "We have guests tonight to celebrate your homecoming." And she chatted to him, and she welcomed him, and she hugged him and kissed him, and walked with him into the great hall, and never gave him a moment, never gave him a second to ask her about spinning or thread or shirts or anything like that. And she sat him down at the high table, which was laid for a splendid supper. She brought him a bowl of hot water to wash his hands, and then she poured wine for him, and as she did so, there came the pitter-patter-clatter of 7 pairs of boot heels, and in came the little women in their gowns of green silk. And the husband stared at them, but he was too much of a gentleman to ask questions, and immediately, of course, he saw the women's twisted mouths, those twisted, lopsided mouths like Scots pine trees leaning on the wind. An excellent supper was served. Many courses, good wine, polite conversation. But by the end of the meal, the husband had a fair amount of wine inside him. And then he couldn't help himself. He leaned across the table to the most senior of the little women in green. And he said, "Madam, I couldn't help noticing each one of you, you yourself and all your companions, you have such twisted mouths. I have never seen the like. Could you explain to me how that comes about?" And the little woman in green grinned at him. "Oh, well, it's the spinning, you see. Every time you bite off the thread, you're twisting your mouth, and over the years, well, it stays with you. There's no surer way to ruin a lady's looks than with the spinning. Well, you should have seen the husband's face as he heard those words. And soon after, the ladies in green took their leave, and their pairs of boot heels pitter-patter clattered out, and they were gone. And the moment they'd gone, the husband commanded the servants to go fetch that spinning wheel down from the attic and take it outside and all that flax and burn the lot on a bright bonfire. The wife said nothing. And I am told that to the end of their days together, the husband and wife were entirely happy, never a cross word between them, and never the clack of a spinning wheel to disturb the peace of that house. Thank you.